Alright folks, welcome to the fourth lesson, which is how to use your pieces in an endgame. Let me remind you that there are two steps of planning. First, you should realize what you're going to do, and secondly, you need to decide how exactly you will do it. Concerning the first step, there are two main endgame plans. You can attack the opponent's weak pawns, or you can use your passed pawns. In the previous lessons, we have analyzed these plans and their specific characteristics. This knowledge will help you to realize what you should do in a certain endgame position. After that, you should go to the second step of planning. You need to decide how exactly you will realize your plan. It implies the question how to use your pieces to realize a given plan. And that's what we will talk about in this lesson. Generally, everything is quite simple. You should think about every piece and every pawn you have and ask yourself a question: where should I place this piece to realize my plan? Here I have some good news for you. The answer to this question is already no. Yes, there are a lot of ready-made decisions and recommendations about it. Thus, you don't have to think hard during the game. You will simply follow the recommendations of this lesson. Okay, there is another important thing I'd like to tell you here. An endgame shows all the strategic motives clearly. In a middle game, concrete tactical variations are often a decisive factor. An endgame illustrates clearly the strategical principles. That's why, when you improve your endgame skills, you improve your general strategic understanding at the same time. Remember the well-known masters of an endgame: Capablanca, Karpov, Kramnik, and others. They all have a crystal clear positional style of a game. They never made bad mistakes. All the rules presented in this course on Endgame Expert work perfectly in an endgame, but they work in all other stages of a game as well. If you study this course seriously, you will improve not only your endgame skills, but your general understanding of a game. Okay, now let's come back to this lesson's topic: how to use your pieces to realize a given plan. We will discuss every piece one after another. A closer look at the king. As you probably know, in an endgame, a king becomes an active piece. Its power is approximately equal to a knight, and that's why in an endgame you should bring your king into a center. Quite often when an endgame happens, your king is the least active piece at the moment. That's why often you need to activate a king first of all. Of course, at the same time you should try to keep an opponent's king out of a game. A typical idea is to cut off an opponent's king on the last rank. Okay, now I'm going to tell you the next extremely powerful idea which most players don't understand. A king works best with pawns. It doesn't matter whether it's your pawns or your opponent's ones. A king is a very suitable piece to attack opponent's pawns or to support your passed pawns. Let's take a look at an example. White certainly has an advantage. He is up a pawn and has more active position. At the same time, black is keeping a defense, and it's not so simple for white to get progress. What should white do now? According to the principle of the least active piece, white should activate his king. As you already know, a king works best with pawns. Thus, white should move the king towards black's pawns. White played king g3, rook e6, king f4, king e8. Black has nothing to do really. White took and played king f5. Now the f6 pawn being attacked. Rook d6, king g6. Now you can see why it is so good to attack opponent's pawns by your king. A king attacks all the squares around. Thus it attacks all the opponent's pawns on a certain flank. For example, in the current position, the king is attacking the f6 and the h5 pawns. Black can protect both of them, and it's time for black to resign. I'd like you to pay attention to this idea because it's very powerful. If you can bring your king to the opponent's pawns, it can be enough for a win. It's an endgame and both players should bring their kings into the center. On the previous move, white played rook e1 to cut off an opponent's king from a center. It's a typical idea and it's useful to remember it. Okay, now let's think about the white's king. If white plays king f2 right now, black may start making checks. Rook f6, then if king goes to the e line, he can go rook e8 check. That's why it may be not very convenient for white. In such positions, you should bring a king into the center under the lee. White can first play rook e3, and then bring the king into the center behind his pieces. Something like king f2, e2, d3. Let's see what happened in the game. King f8, king f2, f5, king e2, rook e8. Black is also trying to transfer the king into the center. Rook c4, rook takes, king e7. If white plays king d4 now, black will answer rook g6, taking the g2 pawn and threatening rook g4 check. That's why white needs to make a little preparation. White played g3 first. King d8, now the king may go forward, king f4, rook f6 and king e5. The best position for a king is the central squares. Also, the king works best with pawns. So the white's king has an ideal position. It's in the center, it supports the d5 passed pawn, and attacks the f5 pawn. Rook f8, rook b4, taking the b6 pawn, rook f6, knight e2, the knight goes to e6, through the d4 or f4 square, king e7, rook c4. Due to the active king, white is dominating. White actually can do any moves. Now he is going to go rook c7. Black played b5, rook c7, rook b6, knight d4, taking the f5 pawn, king d8, d6, the pawn goes forward, b4, and knight e6 check. Now white is winning. White is attacking the pawn and is making check. Black can't really take because after take and king takes, on the next move, for instance after b takes a3, white is threatening rook takes g7 and then rook g8 mate. The next piece we'll talk about is the queen. Same with all other pieces, a queen is the most active in a center. In a middle game, however, it's usually bad to centralize a queen because an opponent can attack it. Therefore, there is a rule. The more pieces you trade, the more centralized your queen should be. When you have only a few pieces on the board, you should place a queen exactly in a center. Next, as you know, a queen can attack in many different directions. Therefore, you should try to create a lot of weaknesses in an opponent's position. Then you will be able to use the full power of your queen. In the endgame, you should use your queen to attack opponent's weak pawns, support your passed pawns, and attack an opponent's king or make checks. Ideally, your queen should do all these things simultaneously. Now the black's queen is only attacking the b5 pawn. Of course, it's not enough for a so powerful piece. That's why black needs to create more weaknesses in the white's position. Black played f5, and after queen b8, e4. After f takes e4, the situation becomes more open, and now the queen has a lot of objects of an attack. He played queen d3, king f4, queen takes e4, king g3, queen g4, the queen becomes really active, king f2, queen takes h4, black took all the white's kingside pawns with temples and certainly get a winning position. King f3. Let's take a look at this position. Here the black's queen should protect the a7 pawn, attack the b5 pawn and support his passed pawns on the king side. It means that the queen has a lot of work and it's great. Black will be able to use the full power of his queen. Black played queen e4, king f2, queen d4, king f3, f4. The black's queen is protecting all his pawns and is threatening queen e3 check. White played king g4, queen g1 check. Now white can't take the pawn on f4 because of queen h2, winning the queen b8. That's why white played king f5, and after f3, white has no idea how to stop the pawn and black's winning. Next stuff to check out is the rook. Here everything is quite simple. First, a rook needs to have open lines. When you have a rook, you need to push the pawns forward and exchange them to make your rook active. Secondly, a rook works well with pawns. Thus, a rook is good when you need to support an advancement of your passed pawns or stop an opponent's pawn. There is an old rule: you should put the rook behind the passed pawn. It doesn't matter whether it's your pawn or an opponent's one. This rule is not absolute, but it works often. These are all the specific rules about rook really, so let's move forward. The bishop. A bishop needs to have open diagonals. Therefore, when you have a rook or a bishop, you should try to open a position. You should keep your pawns on the opposite color comparing to your bishop. This leaves open diagonals for your bishop and allows it to be more active. Next, a bishop can and should work on both sides of the board. You should play on both flanks because it allows you to use the full power of a bishop. And the last thing, a bishop works well with pawns. It can support your passed pawns or stop opponent's pawns or even realize both of these functions. A lot of players would simply agree to a draw in such a position. In the first lesson, I have told you that a majority of players don't understand an endgame and don't know what to do here. Let's try to make something better instead. White has a rook and a bishop. They are not active because there are not enough open lines for them. Therefore, white should move the pawns to open more lines. White played g4. It's certainly bad for black to take. Knight takes g4 because white will answer rook g1 and will take the g7 pawn then. Black played c6, g5, knight d7, h4. White is still moving the pawns. b5. It seems like an active move, but really it helps white. After bishop d3, white is attacking the h7 pawn. Knight f8, bishop e4. Now the bishop is attacking both sides of the board, which is just an ideal situation for a bishop. Rook c8, and here white played a4. White wants to open more lines for his rook. After a6, a takes, c takes, and rook a1, black can protect his a6 pawn, and white won the game afterwards. Of course, this game is not perfect. Actually, it's just one of my 1-minute blitz games. Nevertheless, I showed you this game because I want to illustrate that everything is very simple for you when you know what to think about. In this case, you will play quickly and you will find the right moves automatically. Next, we'll talk about the knight. A knight is good when an opponent has a lot of weaknesses. In this case, a knight can attack them and use tactics, a fork. Usually bishops are stronger than knights in an endgame. In this position, however, we can see an opposite situation. When an opponent has a lot of weaknesses, it's good for knights because of two main reasons. The first reason, the knights have a lot of objects of an attack. And the second reason, the knights have a lot of good squares to be placed on. Here I mean the weak squares in an opponent's position. Let's see what happened in the game. Black played knight d4, then rook b1, the rook wants to go to b8, bishop f8. Black also needs to protect the c5 pawn, by the way. h4, rook b3, rook d1. The white's knights are very active and can go to c5, d6, f6, g5, can take on c5, so really black always has to worry about something like that. Black played bishop a6, white took the knight and won the pawn, bishop e7, and now knight e5. White is using the weak squares of the black's position to place the knights there. Now after bishop takes h4, white can go knight d2, attacking the rook and the bishop also. It's not winning for white, but it gives white a better endgame. Okay, let's go back. A very interesting line happens after rook takes a3. White answers rook d7. The bishop has to counter the f6 square, that's why bishop takes h4 is the only move. And now g3 suddenly captures the bishop. This example illustrates that the knights are very active in positions with numerous weaknesses. In this case, knights have good squares to be placed on, have a lot of objects of an attack, and can use different tactical motifs. Another advantage of the knight is that it can restrict an opponent's king. For example, in this position black is much more active but can't get any progress. A knight controls two squares in front of an opponent's king. If you can take a control over the first square somehow, you create an unassailable barrier for an opponent's king. This idea is also used in positions with a knight against a rook. The white's knight is controlling two squares in front of the black's king, and the white's king should keep control over the first square. In this case, black can't get any advancement. Something like king e5, king f3, king d4. White is always controlling three squares in front of the black's king, and black can't go forward. Rook a4, king e5, and white is keeping the fortress. A knight has two disadvantages in an endgame. First, it can play only on one side. Only a king and a knight have this weakness. And the second one is difficult for a knight to stop side pawns. Here the knight has 6 available squares to stop the d6 passed pawn. If we replace the pawn to h6, then the knight has only 3 squares. That's why it's difficult for a knight to stop side pawns. By the way, when I say side pawns, I mean the pawns on the two side lines. The black's position looks well protected. However, white has a winning combination. g5, h takes, knight takes g7, and h6. White is using the weakness of a knight, which can stop a side pawn. Knight h5, h7, knight f4, Black found a really good idea. White can't take the knight certainly, because after e takes, the bishop d4 will control the h8 square. That's why white shouldn't do it. White played king g3 instead. Knight g6, king g4. Though black was able to stop the pawn, his position is still losing. Bishop e8, bishop takes g5, knight h8. Black can't do anything really. Bishop f6, knight g6, king f5. White simply goes forward. Bishop e3, and here after h8 and knight takes h8, white can take the knight right now, or better, white should take the e5 first and then take back the knight. After that, white will get a decisive material advantage and a winning position. That's why black resigned. The last material we need to discuss in this lesson is the pawn. We have been talking a lot about pawns in this course. Nevertheless, I'd like to clarify a few key ideas here. Pawn structure becomes an extremely important factor in an endgame. It determines the plans of both sides, and often it determines an evaluation of a position. That's why you should be very careful with pawn moves. Don't make any pawn move if it's not necessary. I'm not saying that you should not move pawns at all. Of course not. An advancement of your passed pawns is one of two main endgame plans. I just say that you need to be very careful with pawn moves. Think twice before doing it. Be sure that your pawn move is well prepared and is not great in weaknesses. Remember that advanced pawns are good for an attack, but bad for a defense. Unnecessary pawn moves is the most common mistake of amateur players in an endgame. They try to make active moves and start pushing the pawns forward. However, it creates long-term weaknesses in a position, and it leads to a loss in the end. Here is a normal endgame position. White is slightly better, and he could simply play c3 now. Instead of that, he decided to play aggressively. b4, knight c6, b5. Black played knight b4, taking the c2 pawn. Knight e1. White calculated that after an exchange on c2, let's say knight takes and bishop takes, white will play rook c1 and will then take back the pawn on the c7, getting an active position. An experienced player would not spend much time on such calculations, because he knows that it can be good for white to create weaknesses in his position. White has moved a pawn. Let's look at this position here. After b4, b5, white moved a pawn and has created stable weaknesses in his position, which can be good. Black simply played knight d5 instead, bishop d2, and f6. A few moves ago it was quite difficult for black to find an aggressive plan. Now black has an obvious plan of an attack of the white's weaknesses. c4, knight b6, bishop b4. The situation looks unclear, however, there is no doubt here really. Black has an advantage because of the white's weaknesses. Black actually may play any move now. Even after something simple like rook f8, black is better. In an endgame, you can't crush an opponent's position. Even if your attack looks strong, an opponent can keep his position in most cases. That's why you should be very careful with pawn moves. When your attack is over, all your weaknesses will remain. The white style of playing would be very good for a middle game, but it's not suitable for an endgame. In the game, black played rook takes d4, bishop e7, rook e8, e takes, and rook e4. Though white is trying to attack, it doesn't create serious problems for black. White doesn't have enough pieces to mate an opponent's king or to create concrete threats. White took, black took on e2, bishop g5, knight takes pawn, Now white has to pay for his previous mistakes. Black starts taking the white's weak pawns. Knight f3, king takes g7, knight d4, rook e4, white took on f5, rook takes. White played ingeniously and was able to keep an equal material situation. However, he is still in trouble because of his weak pawns. You can see why it's so important to be careful with pawn moves in an endgame. They create stable weaknesses, and you have to pay for it during the whole game long. Black played king g6, rook f1, knight d6, rook c5, rook 8 e5. Black is attacking the weakness on the b5 and the bishop g5 certainly. White took, black took, bishop f4, and rook takes b5. Finally, black won the b5 pawn and the game afterwards. It may have been dismaying for white that he lost the game because of the b pawn exactly, which he carelessly pushed forward to start an unfounded attack. Let's look at this idea from another side also. When your opponent moves a pawn in an endgame, you should say to yourself, "Wow, it's great, he's weakening his position. How can I attack it now?" Okay, we have discussed all the pieces, and now let's make up some conclusions. The first conclusion. There are two steps of planning. First, you should realize what you're going to do. Secondly, you need to decide how exactly you will do it. Concerning the first step, there are two main endgame plans. You can attack the opponent's weak pawns, or you can use your passed pawns. Concerning the second step, you should ask yourself a question: how to use your pieces to realize a given plan. There are a lot of ready-made recommendations of how to use each piece in an endgame. The king. You should centralize it. Often you should centralize a king under the lee of other pieces. Also, you should try to cut off an opponent's king. And the second thing, a king works best with pawns. It can support your passed pawns or penetrate into an opponent's territory and attack his pawns. Next piece, the queen. First, you should centralize it. Secondly, you should attack in many directions. You can attack his weak pawns, support your passed pawns, and attack or make checks to his king. The rook. It needs open files, thus you should push pawns to open a position. And the second thing, it should stand behind the passed pawn. Okay, the next thing, the bishop. First, it also needs open lines. Secondly, it should play on both flanks. Thus, you should start playing on both flanks when you have a bishop. Next idea, you should keep your pawns on the opposite color comparing to your bishop. The knight. It attacks weaknesses well, and it uses tactics. These two ideas are closely connected. When a knight attacks weaknesses, it uses tactics well. Next, it can restrict an opponent's king, to set a barrier on a king's way. And there are some disadvantages of the knight. It can play only on one flank, and it struggles against side pawns badly. And now we come to the pawn. There are only two main principles here. The first one, you should be very careful with pawn moves. Don't move them when it's not necessary. And secondly, you should move your passed pawns. Okay, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for your attention. Talk to you in the next lesson.